In February of 1931, the mine owners of Harlan County, Kentucky unanimously decided to lower the wages of their employees by about 10%. Bear in mind that these employees made significantly less than what was the national average, and in response, United Mine Workers of America had a push to organize labor in the county. However, this was the days before there were laws protecting organized labor, and in response, the sheriff of Harlan County, J.H. Blair, immediately began vocally supporting and working for the mine owners. In fact, the mine owners would give him lists of people to arrest, and he would go out and put them in jail, claiming they were communists. Now, in response to this, the miners, by and large, totally walked out of the mines, and at its height, these strikes had about 5,800 people up in the hills on strike, and only about 800 or 900 continuing to work. This was a show of solidarity for the imprisoned miners. But Sheriff J.H. Blair made it very obvious that he wasn't going to deal with this, so he began totally terrorizing people. And what the miners quickly realized was that the majority of the towns in the local area were owned by the mine owners. That meant if they felt that you were at risk of joining the union or had ever made any statement supporting them, they could evict you from your home. And now you are a homeless person on company property, and the sheriff will sick his goons on you and throw you in jail or simply disappear you. And this began to escalate until May 5th, 1931, which saw the Battle of Everts.
This is where the ambush actually took place, at the mouth of Everts. Battle of Everts, 1931. And also, this battle, you have to understand, it came about a decade after the Battle of Blair Mountain. And when all those miners were threatened with life in prison and given military tribunals, they pretty much were released by the president once he was elected. So a lot of people seemed to think that maybe if they could just get this conflict on a large enough scale and gather enough sympathy, then they would be, history would justify their actions. And I mean, to an extent, history has, but the law never did.
Remember how I said that the majority of towns were owned by the companies? Well, the town of Everts was the largest that wasn't company owned, and they had some sympathies towards the miners. So on that day, the companies decided to drive 3 armored cars through town. Very out in the open. They wanted to do a show of force, and these cars all had 1 deputy in them, a couple of scabs, and supplies that they were bringing to the mines north of town. And instantly they were ambushed. They expected some degree of violence, but they didn't expect the battle that would occur. 1,000 rounds of ammunition were fired, 3 deputies died, and 1 miner was killed. And in response to this, even though they don't know who fired the fatal shots, 8 people who were on the side of the Union were imprisoned for life for murder. And immediately the Red Cross pulled out support, saying that they don't support communists. And the sheriff called in the Kentucky National Guard. Well, when the National Guard soldiers came by, the miners actually celebrated because they said, these are local boys, they know us, they'll support us. However, immediately the National Guard began to destroy the strike lines, they forced miners back to work, and the sheriff began tear gassing mine meetings. And this all kind of crumbled as the UMW strike fund evaporated. And then comes Harry Sims. Now, Harry Sims is a truly, truly fascinating figure. He worked for the Young Communist League, which was the youth organ of Communist Party USA. And at this point, Communist Party USA was taking its marching orders from Comintern based out of the Soviet Union. And Comintern had seen the fact that the American federal government was not keeping up in any way with organized labor and was allowing perhaps dozens of people to be killed in these conflicts. They'd already had the Battle of Blair Mountain and the massacre at Matewan, and Comintern felt that they could send in people who were charismatic, like the 20-year-old Harry Sims, to organize the miners. And Harry Sims said, well, UMW has failed you. Well, we have now the NMU, the National Miners Union. This was kind of in keeping with CPUSA and Comintern standards of creating front groups which didn't ostensibly look communist, but once they entrusted you with with a certain degree of information, you would realize that the money was basically coming from the Soviet Union. In fact, 10 of their chapters opened immediately, and they began to open soup kitchens. But at this point in time, it seemed to be that fewer miners were joining them because they realized that this was an ephemeral thing. What was the final nail in the coffin for the National Miners Union, and by default the Communist Party USA, was the clergy. The clergy kind of made it very clear that the NMU was anti-religion because they were a mouthpiece for the communists. And very shortly after, about a year after all of this began, Harry Sims was gunned down in the woods by thugs for the sheriff. He was shot in cold blood. And this is a 20-year-old kid. And after this, you had the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1931, which aimed to enable the mines to open up with unionists. But this didn't really last long. They called it a toothless act, and eventually the sheriff called in the National Guard again, or actually the miners called in the National Guard. See, at that point in time, Sheriff J.H. Blair had retired, he had been voted out, and he died in 1934 to be replaced by a pro-union sheriff. However, the miners were still upset at the huge number of them that had been killed by the sheriff, as well as the fact that the sheriff's deputies were still roving the hills looking for union members, and the new sheriff didn't really seem to be doing anything about it. So the miners requested the National Guard, but again, the National Guard returned, and even though they were at the request of the miners, they escorted all the miners to the county line and told them, get out. In 1935, there was another act, I believe the Wagner Act, which was passed, which finally sort of ended the conflict, but up until 1939, there was a small insurgency on the ground between the miners and the sheriff and his deputies.